On October 24, 1953, a 15-year-old girl walked into a house to babysit and vanished without a trace. What police found inside was so disturbing, it launched one of the largest manhunts in Wisconsin history. This is the true story of Evelyn Hartley, the babysitter who disappeared into thin air. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I read every single one. Along the tranquil banks of the Mississippi River in southwest Wisconsin sits the charming city of La Crosse, a place where neighbors knew each other's names and children played safely in tree-lined streets. In 1953, this idyllic community regularly ranked among Wisconsin's most desirable places to live. The Victorian houses stood like proud sentinels along well-maintained sidewalks, their wraparound porches decorated with autumn decorations and jack-o'-lanterns that glowed warmly in the crisp October evenings. But beneath this picture-perfect facade, something sinister was stirring. On the night of October 24th, this peaceful town would become the backdrop for a mystery so chilling it would haunt residents for generations and leave investigators baffled for decades to come. 15-year-old Evelyn Grace Hartley was the embodiment of 1950s American innocence. A bright sophomore at Central High School, she lived a quiet, structured life with her parents in their comfortable home on Villa Street. Her father, Richard Hartley, was a respected biology professor at La Crosse State Teachers College, known for his methodical approach to both science and life. Her mother, Ethel, was a devoted homemaker who took pride in maintaining their household and raising their daughter with strong moral values. Evelyn was the kind of teenager parents in the neighborhood trusted implicitly, responsible, punctual, and mature beyond her years. She wore her brown hair in the fashionable style of the era, and her wire-rimmed glasses gave her an studious appearance that matched her academic achievements. When local families needed a babysitter, Evelyn's name was always at the top of their list. On that fateful Saturday evening, as darkness began to settle over La Crosse like a heavy blanket, Evelyn prepared for what seemed like an ordinary babysitting job. She carefully selected her outfit: red jeans that were her favorite, a crisp white blouse that her mother had pressed that morning, and her characteristic white bobby socks that she always wore with her brown Oxford shoes. She placed her wire-rimmed glasses on her nose, checked her appearance in the mirror one last time, and gathered her books, planning to study while the baby slept. The Hartley household was filled with the comfortable sounds of a Saturday evening, the radio playing softly in the background, her father grading papers in his study, her mother tidying up after dinner. None of them could have imagined that this ordinary evening ritual would be the last time they would see Evelyn alive. Her destination was the home of Viggo Rasmussen, another college professor who lived with his wife and their 20-month-old baby in a modest 2-story house on Prospect Street. The Rasmussens were a young academic couple, much like the Hartleys, trying to balance their professional lives with the demands of raising a small child. They had arranged for Evelyn to babysit while they attended an evening social function at the college. The job seemed routine. The baby was a good sleeper, and Evelyn had babysat for other families in the neighborhood dozens of times without incident. As she walked through the crisp autumn air toward the Rasmussen residence, her footsteps echoing softly on the sidewalk, she had no idea that she was walking directly into the path of something evil that was lurking in the shadows of her peaceful town. The Rasmussen house stood among other similar homes in the neighborhood, a typical 1950s American family dwelling with a front porch, well-maintained yard, and the warm glow of electric lights visible through lace-curtained windows. When Evelyn arrived at approximately 7:30 p.m., she was welcomed inside by the Rasmussens, who gave her their usual instructions about the baby's routine, emergency phone numbers, and when they expected to return. The baby was already settled for the night in his upstairs bedroom, sleeping peacefully in his crib, blissfully unaware of the terror that would soon unfold in the rooms below. The Rasmussens left for their evening out, entrusting their most precious possession to a teenager they believed they could trust completely. As their car disappeared into the darkness, Evelyn settled into her babysitting routine, perhaps opening her books to study or simply enjoying the quiet evening in the comfortable living room. But something was terribly wrong in the peaceful neighborhood that night. Somewhere in the darkness, a predator was watching, waiting, planning. Whether this evil had been stalking Evelyn specifically, or whether she simply had the misfortune to cross paths with someone with malicious intent, would remain one of the most haunting questions of the case. As the evening progressed and the streets grew quieter, the stage was being set for a crime so brutal and mysterious that it would defy explanation for decades. Hours passed in what should have been peaceful silence. Evelyn had a habit of calling her parents during her babysitting jobs to check in and let them know everything was going well. It was one of the responsible behaviors that had earned her such a stellar reputation among the families in the neighborhood. But as the evening wore on, no call came to the Hartley household. Richard Hartley, a man accustomed to his daughter's reliable habits, began to feel the first stirrings of unease. He glanced at the clock repeatedly, each passing minute adding to his growing anxiety. When he could no longer ignore his parental instincts, he picked up the telephone and dialed the Rasmussen number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, but no one answered. He tried again, letting it ring longer, but still only silence greeted him from the other end of the line. The worry that had been gnawing at Richard Hartley's mind suddenly transformed into cold, paralyzing dread. This wasn't like Evelyn. She was always responsible, always answered the phone when she was babysitting. Something was wrong, terribly, horribly wrong. Without hesitation, he grabbed his coat and car keys and drove through the dark streets toward the Rasmussen house, his mind racing through increasingly frightening possibilities. When he arrived at the house, he found it dark except for a few scattered lights, and his repeated knocking on the front door yielded no response. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own increasingly frantic knocking echoing through the night air. In his desperation, Richard Hartley began to circle the house, looking for any sign of life, any indication of what might have happened to his daughter. That's when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. A basement window was open, its screen torn and hanging at an odd angle. With a father's desperate determination, he squeezed through the narrow opening and entered the house through the basement. What he discovered inside would haunt him for the rest of his life and transform the quiet Rasmussen home into the epicenter of one of Wisconsin's most baffling criminal investigations. The house was eerily silent, filled with an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press down on him like a physical weight. He called out Evelyn's name, his voice echoing through the empty rooms, but only silence answered back. As he made his way upstairs, he found the baby sleeping peacefully in his crib, completely unharmed and unaware of whatever nightmare had unfolded in his home. But Evelyn was nowhere to be found. The house felt violated, as if something evil had passed through its halls and left behind an invisible stain of malevolence that would never be completely cleansed. When the police arrived at the scene, they discovered evidence that would chill them to the bone and launch one of the most intensive investigations in Wisconsin history. The living room showed clear signs of a violent struggle. One of Evelyn's brown Oxford shoes lay abandoned on the hardwood floor, as if it had been torn from her foot during a desperate fight. Her wire-rimmed glasses were found broken and scattered, the lenses shattered into fragments that caught the light from the investigators' flashlights like tiny, accusing eyes. But it was what they found next that confirmed their worst fears and transformed this from a missing person case into something far more sinister. Dark stains splattered across the living room floor and furniture, stains that would later be confirmed as human blood. The pattern and distribution of the blood suggested a violent altercation, someone fighting desperately for their life against an attacker who showed no mercy. Evelyn's second shoe was discovered in another room, indicating that the struggle had moved through multiple areas of the house. The investigators' trained eyes read the scene like a horrific story written in blood and violence, each piece of evidence adding another chapter to a tale of terror that no parent should ever have to hear about, too. Child. The horror extended beyond the house's walls, creating a trail of evidence that led investigators to even more disturbing conclusions. In the yard behind the house, more blood painted a gruesome path across the grass and concrete, as if someone had been dragged against their will toward an unknown fate. But it was the discovery at the garage, that would become one of the most haunting images of the entire investigation. Bloody handprints smeared against the white garage door, desperate impressions left by someone who was fighting with every ounce of strength they possessed. The handprints were analyzed and determined to be consistent with those of a young woman, likely made by someone who was injured and trying to escape or prevent themselves from being taken. Bloodhounds were brought to the scene, their sensitive noses following the scent trail that human investigators could not detect. The dogs led authorities on a chilling journey from the house to the garage, then out to the street, where the trail abruptly ended. This led investigators to the terrifying conclusion that Evelyn had been forcibly removed from the property and taken away in a vehicle. Somewhere in those dark October hours, a 15-year-old girl had been dragged from a house where she was simply trying to earn some spending money by watching a sleeping baby and forced into a car that would carry her toward an unknown fate. News of Evelyn's disappearance spread through La Crosse like wildfire, transforming the peaceful community into a hive of fear and desperate activity. What followed was one of the largest search efforts in Wisconsin history, a massive mobilization of human resources that would continue for weeks and involve thousands of volunteers. Over 2,000 people from all walks of life abandoned their normal routines to join the hunt for the missing teenager. Students from local colleges and high schools skipped classes to comb through fields and forests. Farmers left their harvests to search their own properties and neighboring lands. Businessmen closed their shops early to join search parties that worked from dawn until dusk. The National Guard was called in to provide military precision to the search efforts, their personnel trained in systematic search techniques that civilian volunteers lacked. The Civil Air Patrol launched aircraft to scan the countryside from above, their pilots and observers searching for any sign of the missing girl or clues to her whereabouts. The Air Force contributed additional aircraft and personnel, turning the skies above La Crosse into a constant patrol zone where planes and helicopters crisscrossed the landscape in carefully coordinated search patterns. On the rivers and lakes, boats of every description, from Coast Guard vessels to private fishing boats, searched every waterway, their crews dragging nets and using sonar equipment to probe the murky depths for signs of Evelyn. The search effort expanded far beyond the immediate area around La Crosse, reaching into neighboring states as authorities considered the possibility that Evelyn might have been taken far from her hometown. Roadblocks were established on major highways, with officers stopping vehicles and questioning drivers about their activities on the night of October 24th. Radio station A's throughout the Midwest broadcast regular updates about the search, asking listeners to report any unusual activities or sightings that might be related to the case. Newspapers across the region carried Evelyn's photograph on their front pages, turning her image into one of the most recognizable faces in America during the weeks following her disappearance. But perhaps the most unprecedented aspect of the investigation was the decision by local authorities to implement a county-wide vehicle inspection program. Every single car in La Crosse County would be searched, an undertaking that involved examining approximately 40,000 vehicles for any trace of blood, hair, clothing fibers, or other evidence that might link them to Evelyn's disappearance. Special inspection stations were set up throughout the county, staffed by police officers and volunteers who methodically examined each vehicle's trunk, back seat, and any other area where evidence might be hidden. Cars that passed the inspection received stickers reading, "My car is okay," creating a visible symbol of cooperation with the investigation that also served to identify vehicles that had not yet been searched. Gas station owners throughout the region were instructed to report any vehicles that appeared suspicious or any drivers who seemed nervous or reluctant to cooperate with the search efforts. The entire community became part of the investigation, with ordinary citizens transformed into amateur detectives who scrutinized their neighbors and strangers with new suspicion. The atmosphere in La Crosse shifted from small-town trust to paranoid vigilance as residents began to realize that a predator had been living among them, hiding behind a mask of normalcy while planning and executing a crime of unprecedented brutality. Despite the massive scale of the search efforts, days turned into weeks without any significant breakthroughs. Leads came in constantly, Reported sightings of Evelyn in distant cities, tips about suspicious individuals, theories from armchair detectives who believed they had solved the case. Each lead was pursued with dogged determination, but one by one they proved to be false hopes or mistaken identities. The investigation files grew thicker, filled with thousands of pages of witness statements, search reports, and dead-end investigations. But Evelyn herself remained as elusive as a ghost. In the midst of their darkest hour, the Hartley family received a series of phone calls that would add another layer of cruelty to their unimaginable suffering. A man identifying himself as someone with knowledge of Evelyn's fate contacted them, claiming that he could provide information about their daughter's whereabouts for a price. He demanded $500 in exchange for revealing what had happened to Evelyn, preying on their desperate hope and willingness to do anything to bring their daughter home. The family, working with police, arranged to meet with the caller, but when officers arrested Jack Dufferin at the designated location, they discovered that he was nothing more than a heartless opportunist who had seen their tragedy as a chance to make easy money. He knew nothing about Evelyn's actual fate and had simply invented his story to exploit their grief for financial gain. Weeks into the investigation, two pieces of evidence emerged that would add new dimensions to the mystery and fuel speculation about the nature of Evelyn's disappearance. Along Highway 14, approximately 10 miles from La Crosse, investigators discovered a pair of large tennis shoes with a distinctive tread pattern. When compared to footprint impressions found at the Rasmussen house, the shoes were determined to be a perfect match. The implications were chilling. Whoever had taken Evelyn had walked through her blood and left their footprints at the crime scene, then discarded their shoes along a remote highway when they realized the evidence they carried. Near the location where the shoes were found, investigators made another disturbing discovery, a blood-stained denim jacket that appeared to have been hastily discarded. However, the jacket presented a puzzling contradiction that would perplex investigators for years to come. The tennis shoes were size 11, indicating they belonged to someone with large feet, likely a tall man. But the denim jacket was size 36, far too small for someone who would wear size 11 shoes. This led Detective A.M. Josephson, who was leading the investigation, to develop a theory that would make the crime even more terrifying: that two people had been involved in Evelyn's kidnapping and probable murder. The possibility that multiple perpetrators had collaborated in the crime opened up new avenues of investigation, but also made the case exponentially more complex. If two people had been involved, it suggested a level of premeditation and planning that made the crime even more heinous. It also meant that somewhere in the community there might be two individuals who shared the secret of what had happened to Evelyn Hartley, two people who had returned to their normal lives while carrying the knowledge of their unspeakable act. In 1957, the case took an even more sinister turn when Ed Gein, the notorious killer and body snatcher whose crimes would later inspire movies like Psycho and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, became a person of interest in Evelyn's disappearance. Gein had been in the La Crosse area around the time of Evelyn's disappearance, and his documented history of violence against women made him a compelling suspect. The mere possibility that such a monster might have crossed paths with the innocent teenager added new layers of horror to an already nightmarish case. Gein was subjected to extensive questioning and lie detector tests, with investigators hoping that they had finally found the answer to the mystery that had haunted them for years. However, despite their best efforts, no evidence could be found to connect him to Evelyn's disappearance. The lie detector tests indicated that he was telling the truth when he denied involvement in the case, and searches of his property and possessions yielded no trace of Evelyn or any evidence linking him to the crime. While Gein would later be convicted of other horrific murders, the Evelyn Hartley case remained unsolved, its secrets locked away as securely as ever. As the years passed, the investigation continued to generate false confessions and misleading tips from individuals seeking attention or notoriety. Troubled souls emerged from the shadows to claim responsibility for Evelyn's disappearance, each confession raising hopes that the case might finally be solved, only to have those hopes dashed when the confessions proved to be fabricated. Some confessors seemed to genuinely believe their own stories, perhaps suffering from mental illness or false memories, while others appeared to be motivated by a desire for fame or attention, no matter how dark the circumstances. By the 1970s, the active investigation had wound down, though the case officially remained open. Over 3,000 people had been questioned during the course of the investigation. Hundreds of leads had been pursued to their dead ends, and thousands of man-hours had been devoted to finding answers that seemed to exist just beyond reach. The files filled multiple cabinets at the La Crosse Police Department, a paper monument to one of the most extensive criminal investigations in Wisconsin history. In 1978, 25 years after their daughter's disappearance, Richard and Ethel Hartley gave what would be their final interview about the case. The years had aged them beyond their chronological years, their faces bearing the deep lines and shadows that come from carrying unimaginable grief for decades. In voices heavy with exhaustion and resignation, they admitted that they no longer cared to read about new developments in the case or to hear about potential suspects. The search for their daughter had consumed their lives, leaving behind only the hollow ache of permanent loss and the recognition that some questions would never be answered. Viggo Rasmussen, the professor whose home had become the scene of the crime, later revealed that he was haunted by visions of what might have happened in his house that October night. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner, every unexpected sound would transport him back to that terrible evening when evil had walked through his halls and stolen an innocent girl who was simply trying to help his family. The house itself seemed to carry the stain of the crime, and the Rasmussens eventually moved away, unable to continue living in a place that held such dark memories. The Evelyn Hartley case became a turning point in American awareness of crimes against children and the vulnerabilities that existed even in seemingly safe communities. It highlighted the reality that predators could be hiding in plain sight, living normal lives while harboring deadly secrets. The case also demonstrated the limitations of even the most extensive law enforcement efforts when confronted with a carefully planned crime that left few clues and no witnesses. Today, more than 70 years after that October night, the questions remain as haunting as ever. What happened to Evelyn Grace Hartley during those missing hours between 7:30 p.m. and 11 p.m. on October 24, 1953? Who was responsible for the blood on the living room floor, the broken glasses, and the desperate handprints on the garage door? Was she the victim of someone she knew and trusted, or did she encounter a stranger whose capacity for evil exceeded all imagination? Did two people collaborate in her disappearance, as the mismatched evidence suggests, or was there a single perpetrator who somehow left behind contradictory clues? The physical evidence from the case still exists in storage, waiting for advances in forensic science that might finally unlock its secrets. DNA analysis, which was not available in 1953, might someday provide answers that eluded investigators for decades, but until that day comes, if it ever does, Evelyn Hartley remains frozen in time, a 15-year-old girl who walked into a house to babysit a sleeping baby and was never seen again. More than 70 years have passed since Evelyn Hartley walked into that house on Prospect Street. Her broken glasses still lie somewhere in the evidence room. Her red jeans and white blouse have faded into memory. But the questions remain as haunting as ever. What happened in those missing hours? Who took her? And why has the truth stayed buried for so long? Perhaps we'll never know. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, lurking in the shadows of our collective nightmares. But one thing is certain. Evil walked the streets of La Crosse that October night, and it left behind a void that can never be filled. If stories like Evelyn's fascinate you, if you're drawn to the dark corners where truth meets mystery, then keep watching the Witness Archives, because every disappeared soul deserves to be remembered, and every unsolved case holds secrets waiting to be uncovered.